Alrighty, how's it going, everybody? My name is Mark, and I call the channel Mark's Music Place for those that are new. For those that have been watching, appreciate you watching the channel, and thanks for watching. You always got to go through the protocols, I guess. So if you like the content, subscribe, hit the bell whenever I do post a video. That's kind of like a little sarcastic because people that have been watching the channel like. So that's kind of like an inside joke. You'll kind of get it. And definitely write some comments and all that. So with that being said, for those that like me, I don't have any fancy intros or underlying music. I like to really just basically get to the point. So the point of this video is this. The point of this video that I decided I was compelled to make was gear misleading. These are misleading gear channels, or when people focus, I focus on the gear, but I try not to focus on gear in the wrong way, because gear, what's the best way to describe it? It's like anything else. You know, it's like anything that you want. You want it, but you don't have it, but you want it. And that's what makes it, a, I don't know, there's a word for it. So we all want stuff that we can't have. And then when we get it, you know, then the feeling and the value of it starts to change a little bit. Depends on your respect for whatever it is that, you know, or your whatever it is that you've been wanting to get something and you finally get it. A lot of that, you start to lose a bit of that dream. I don't know, like I said, there's a word for it. Someone help me out when you finally get something or whatever the case. So what I'm saying is this. There are people making videos that I saw, and I saw one video where it said all rappers use these pieces of gear. And I had to think about that for a second. And I looked at the gear, and it happened to be a 1073 preamp and a TubeTech CLB compressor. And I'm like, okay, you have to understand that not every rapper went to a studio that had Neve preamps in it, or at least the TubeTech. Some studios would have the 1176, or some studios would use LA2As. Some studios use distressors. Some studios use DBXs, and so forth. There are probably 200 plus different types of compressors. Just like there's, I don't know, 100 plus preamps. There's 100 to 200 plus microphones. At least 50 different types of mixing consoles, if not more. There's just so much different variety of gear. Anyone that would believe that that's what every rapper have ever rapped on, it's like making everyone believe that every rapper rapped on a Sony 800 microphone. And not just rapper, but just artists in general. Everybody said the preferred microphone is the Sony. I think it's the S800 or something like that. I can't remember the exact model. When I know for a fact, you hear all the time, some artists are performed on the Telefunken 251. Some are performed on the Neumann U87 microphones. Some artists have recorded on 67s. Some artists have recorded on SM7 dynamic microphones. So it can't be. But what happens is when people make these videos, whether they bought this gear themselves or they're being sponsored by a company, you know, one of the companies or whatever the case, or maybe there is some sort of sponsorship or whatever the case may be, they will mislead a lot of people that watch those videos especially if it's a Tube Tech and a Neve 1073 preamp and maybe a Sony S800 or whatever microphone. I want to double check because I like to make sure I have the proper name of gear. So let me look online. Right, come here to my Mac. Let me go online. Look on Google. I think it's the Sony S800 microphone. Yeah, the Sony S. Okay. Yeah, the Sony C800G microphone. Now, that microphone is about, 10 grand. But Golden Age has one. There's about 4 grand, which is still, ooh. And then the Warm Audio actually has one that's about $1,200. This Sony, it's their version of the Sony C800. Okay. Now, I am not going to doubt that that's probably a great sounding microphone. But I am going to challenge that I don't see how every rapper has rapped on this C800 microphone, because not every studio is equipped to buy those microphones. Not every studio has, Tube Techs. And you can do there are a lot of studios that just don't have a lot of Tube Tech in their racks. There are some studios that do, but there are some studios that do not. With that being said, I don't want people to watch, that I'm glad there are people that watch my channel that realize that there are so many different types of microphone companies. And really, and I want to say this too, even if someone was to use that combination of setup, like the Sony C800, a Neve 1073 preamp with a Tube Tech compressor as their signal chain, how are you going to hear that once they start adding, when it's time to mix and they start throwing on effect processors, delays, kaleidoscopes or whatever, all these types of effects or whatever, auto-tune and everything else? You're not going to really hear the microphone, especially when it's buried down in the mix, when there's EQ there, there's compression there, there's compression on the master bus, and that's all being done in the studio through whatever console they used or whatever. And then that's not even being, understand that it went to a mastering company and they did some EQ and compression and limiters and stuff like that before you finally hear it. So that's a mix. That is a myth, a big giant myth to make you think that every studio has $10,000 Sony C800. The only studio I would believe that would have probably every microphone known to man would be like Blackbird, because he's probably got $1 million in microphones, which is like, if you ever seen his studio tour, it's like, Jesus, he's got so much gear and equipment. But I also want to say this too. Think of gear. Don't ever think that you cannot make great product because you don't have certain pieces of gear. Gear is no different than if a construction worker was using hammer and nails. If he was using a Stanley hammer, or if he was using a Skills hammer, he needs a hammer to hammer the nails. That's all it really is. But the idea of, you take someone, even if you had gear, that's not going to, you can have a whole bunch of gear, but the house or whatever that you're building doesn't come from the gear. It comes from the person, the architect that designed the house. The idea of how this house is supposed to look when you're building it came from the person with a vision. That's the same thing with songs. Songs are people's thoughts of a vision of an idea of expression. No gear No plugin, no software, no DAW can replace great song ideas, because you can have all the gear in the world, all the plugins, all the software in the world. If you don't have any great songs that people like. I saw another video too that one person was saying that they were trying to say that all you need to do is spend, you have to buy this Apollo and this blah blah, you need to spend about $3,400 or whatever and get a Grammy. Not understanding that you could have 10,000 people go buy that setup, and out of those 10,000 people, only maybe 100 people have great song ideas. Well, people are not going to like every song that came, 10,000 songs. So Grammys are voted on by boards, and it's based on popularity, what they call a support board, and they're going to judge you based on how popular your songs are and how well they're doing on the charts and blah, 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 blah. They don't care what gear you recorded on. They don't care if you used the Need 1073 or TubeTech. Grammys can care less. The only time that would, whatever the case, if they were giving out recording and mixing Grammys, which they do, then they're gonna probably consider maybe what techniques. But then again, they're probably not even still considering the gear, because, for example, you can go into this one particular studio and they might have an SSL. Let's say, for example, we're gonna use I think his name was Joshua. He's a well-known mixing engineer that mixed a lot of R&B artists. I think he mixed some Rihanna and so forth, artists like that. And guess what? He works out of Larrabee. And guess what kind of recording console they have in Larrabee? An SSL. I think it's an SSL 6000G as an example. Or not as an example, but I think that's one of the consoles that they have. Well, there's also artists like Van Halen and Prince and Stevie Wonder that went to studios like Sunset. And guess what kind of the consoles, even though they're custom consoles, all the components are pretty much API. So they didn't have a whole lot of TubeTech in their racks that I can remember. Now, United / Oceanway did have some TubeTechs, but they also had 1176s and LA2A compressors and stuff like that as well. So really it boiled down to who was the mixing engineer. There's another studio that, for example, I forget his name right now, I'm drawing a blank on it, but he mixed some artists out of Oceanway United, and he mixed on a Focusrite console. And then there's artists that went to other studios like Conway that did some, like Jay-Z and some other artists that mixed on a Neve. So when we're all listening to these music that's out there for these different artists, it's not the gear to a point. Now, most of these studios have high-end gear, but there's so many different varieties of high-end gear compared to whatever. Now, most of the time it came down to the skill set of the engineer. That's where it boiled down to. How well he mic'd, how well he was able to set up the preamp, how well he was able to set up the compressor, how well he chained it, and so forth. How well the music was done and how well it's mixed and everything else. And it doesn't really matter. So it really boiled down. It really doesn't matter if it went to this studio that had an API console, or went to this studio that had a Neve console, or went to this studio with an SSL, or this studio with an Audient. Most of those studios are so similar in quality. The API versus the Neve versus the SSL versus the MCI versus the Audient versus the Helios. Most of these consoles and compressors and preamps they're all pretty much on the same level of quality for the most part. So it's not the gear. So you don't have to have a certain microphone or a certain preamp or compressor. So they're out there making people believe that that's what you have to have. And that's absolutely false. there are people that probably have a Midas console and it's the standard Midas preamps in their Midas console and can get amazing results using the preamps in their console with the Midas. Midas is a high-end company. And they can use a $300 Rode NT1 and run it through the Midas preamps. And after that, they can actually add on some, if they wanted to, they can add on some plug-in processing. You know, EQ. Doesn't matter if it's slate, waves, UAD, acoustic audio. Doesn't matter. Whatever, if the results come out as good as it depends on what the results are. A lot of times we get caught up on names, and this includes software too. We get caught up on names, and we automatically think because it sounds good and it works for what we got, everyone ought to use what we got. And that's not the case. It's kind of like if you go back in the day and you listen to all the great records being done over the last 20, 30, 40 years, you'll find out, you know, that a lot of times the gear that you thought people were using weren't even the case. It's kind of like you have studios and gear weren't emphasized as much to the public as it is now, but you know, through YouTube and stuff like that. The only people that really emphasized gear at that time was people that was in the business, that were they were basically in the works of purchasing gear for their studio, and they want to try to sort out what would work best for their budget. That's how studios work. They didn't really care about names and all that at the time. They just, you know, for example, the 1176 was just a well-known compressor that everyone liked. People really weren't concerned that it became a staple compressor in studios. Not then. They're like, okay, at the time, it was like one of those kind of pieces of gear that everyone's studio pretty much went with. It's like the Yamaha NS10s. It's not the Yamaha NS10 studio monitors were the best sounding monitors. It was just that everyone, it's like anything that becomes popular and it becomes a staple because it's popular. Doesn't always mean that it's, you know, there's studio monitors, for example, if you have some in the Yamaha NS10s or some Atom A7Vs or whatever, you most likely probably, the Atoms are probably going to 9 times 10 sound better. And most studios, they were just so used to using Yamaha NS10s that it was just a normal thing to buy, and you saw it as a ubiquitous thing in most studios. But now, people are really not using, you know, it's only the studios that's been around for years that still happen to have Yamaha NS10s, and mixing engineers that just happen to be used to using them. But it doesn't mean that, for example, a set of Genelecs or Focals or Barefoots or whatever, you know, studio monitors that you're using, you know, that they're not as good, or the Yamaha NS10s are as good as some of those other monitors, because most of the time you probably get better results with some of the more, because people improve their product through technology and time and so forth. So to sum up the video, because it's going on 20 minutes, I just want to say this. Do not let people, you know, think that if you don't have a Need 1073 and a TubeTech CLB compressor, that's what you need to do great rap records or R&B records or whatever. No. You can probably get away with, if you have a $200 Persona studio channel and a Rode NT1, and people do it all the time in their home studios. They have their setups, you know, they might have something like that Persona studio channel, and they might have a Warm Audio 47 Junior microphone, and that might be it as far as whatever. Then they have the interface, their computer, plug-in software, DAW, and that might be it. You know, they might have a set of KRK studio monitors, whatever. do not be fooled that these people are coming out with great sounding records. The only way they can create a record that don't sound that good, and maybe it's too basic, whatever, is because maybe the acoustics in the room, they're not really good at mixing and recording. They don't really know how to use the gear, the software, so forth. And that's the reason why the record sounds bad. And not necessarily because they didn't have a 1073 and a Tube Tech and a Sony C800G microphone. Don't ever believe that. Most of the time, it's someone, they're trying to create this rap record or whatever, and let's say they were using Studio One software or whatever, and they had a Persona Studio channel and a Golden Age microphone or whatever, and it didn't come out good. It's probably because the acoustics were wrong. They had the microphone, they didn't have the wrapper with, the proximity in front of where they're in front of the microphone was inaccurate to get the right tone quality from the wrapper. Depends on the distance where the wrapper is from, whatever. They didn't have the pop filter correct, so they got all these explosives, getting all these low end B's and P's or whatever. The miking technique was wrong. The preamp was not set up properly. They didn't have the preamp set properly. They didn't have the compressor set up properly and everything else. And that's the reason why it didn't come out good. But if they have all that set up, the acoustics right, they probably can do 99% of the time. When they get it done, they get it recorded properly, they get the tracks mixed properly, and they use whatever plugins and software and everything else within a DAW, whatever. They 9 times 10 can put out a commercial ready product with that piece of gear. So that's going to sum up the video. And I felt compelled to make this video because it irks me when I start seeing that you have to have $3,400 and this bit of setup to get a Grammy, or you need this piece of gear, or this is the gear that every rapper is using, and that's not true. And rappers before home studios started exploding, rappers and artists were going to multiple studios that had different sets of gear and coming out with great results. And that goes back, it didn't really matter. They go to one studio and they happen to have a Newman U87 microphone, and they were running through an API 312 preamp, and they ran it through 1176 compressor, and they recorded through tape or the DAW through an API console or whatever. That's what or this rapper happened to go to this studio, and they happened to have a set of Neve, and they were using an LA2A compressor, and they ran it through an SSL console, and they were listening through on a set of barefoot studio monitors. And then this artist happened to go to this studio, and they have a Neve console, and they're using like I have the Avalon preamps as an example. They were using that. There are lots of people that use the Avalon. That Avalon is an extremely popular super high-end preamp. It's actually more, when it comes to the preamps, it's probably more preferred, especially in the hip-hop community. Oh, I forgot I'm on the Mac. It's actually more preferred in a lot of studios as far as a preamp choice is the Avalon over the Neve. The Neve 1073 is more preferred in a rock and acoustic instrument environment, more than just than recording hip hop. Most people would, if you were doing hip hop vocals, you had the Neve 1073 and the Avalon 737. The Avalon 737 is actually a more popular preamp choice, especially in hip hop. But even though it's used in rock and country and everything else, but so that's going to do it for this video. So I just want to make another video in case you see some of these videos where people are telling you that you have to have certain gear to get a certain result to be like everybody else, and that's not true. It's not the gear. You have to have a skill set to get the result. The skills. If you can't play piano, and I threw you on one of my keyboards, you can't play synths. I don't care what if people see the type of synthesizer I have. I don't care if you can't play synths. You're not gonna make none of those synthesizers sound good if you can't play it. So that's gonna do. Excuse me. That's gonna do it for this video. Thanks for watching. Y'all have a great one.